Welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. We are online at what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find the link to our blog in the episode notes. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and jot down our information wherever you find this episode in case censors decide to deplatform us. Okay. My name is Andy Libson. I'm a teacher in Oakland and a socialist. And again, we're joined by socialist and community organizer Kenny Zepeda and Jessica, who teaches English literature, writing, environmental humanities at the university level in Pacific Northwest. And you will see that Eduardo is still not with us. I think he's going to be back in February. I'm hoping. And Jake is taking a little mini sabbatical from What's Left because he's got a lot of things to attend to. So it's just the three of us today. So welcome, both of you.
Hi, thanks.
So today we were thinking of discussing, in fact, I texted you both about talking about what's going on in Ukraine. And for those of you who are like, oh, great, people on What's Left are going to talk about Ukraine. I'm going to figure out what's going on. That might happen, but I don't think any of us are really experts on Russia, on the United States and Ukraine and stuff like that. I think we know a little bit about some things. But this issue came out of left field for me because I've been thinking so much about mandates and vaccine stuff and things like that, that I kind of wanted to discuss this with the both of you. And I think this is what people can and should do, is just talk about politics and what do they think's going on. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about something we haven't been talking about and see what we think. So I guess what I'll do is I'll start with what I think I know about what's happening right now. And then maybe Jessica, you can add in some stuff. And then Kenny, maybe you can add in some stuff. And then we'll take it from there. So as I understand it, Russian troops are massing on the eastern border of Ukraine, near the Crimea and Donbass, or I don't know if they're in those regions or near those regions. And we're being told that they are threatening to come into, or that these troop movements are threatening to come into the Ukraine. And the U.S., in relationship to that, has released 8,000 troops to be sent into Europe. There's now air flights of getting missiles and things like that into the Ukraine. They can't go over Germany because Germany is not agreeing to it and things like that. But that's one thing I know. And there's been a lot of discussion of war drums beating. And the president was seen as very weak when he kind of suggested, the U.S. president, when he suggested, well, if there was a minor incursion, we would be fine with that. But anything major, and of course, the media and, basically the establishment lost its mind and said, no, there's nothing that can be, if Russia lays an inch of fingers on Ukraine, we're willing to do whatever it takes to make them pay a price of some sort, threatening war even, right? And so people are saying, oh, this is very dangerous, World War III, blah, blah, blah. I guess I'll say that's my opening bid for some of the things that I know about the present moment, as well as I'll just say Russia has a concern or expressed concern over the Ukraine being allowed to join NATO. So I'll start with some present knowledge that I have. And Jessica, I don't know if you want to either add or share anything or say anything different you might know about this current moment.
Okay. Well, first of all, I do believe, Andy, that you predicted World War III is coming several episodes ago. So
I'll say something more about that.
Is this it? I don't know.
I'm going to say definitely not, but I'll tell you why. But we'll get to that. We're going to get to that.
Yeah. No, I think you gave a good kind of brief assessment. I don't know. I mean, I'm certainly, I wish I had a bit more time or have a bit more time to dig more deeply into this, because like you said, it's not a region of the world that I'm super knowledgeable about. But I do know, just to kind of back up from the present moment a little bit, there was a US-backed coup essentially back in 2014. And I think since then, the US has been steadily increasing presence, in the region, kind of funneling weapons, funneling money, like a lot of money, billions of dollars into the region. And so I think, for a lot of us, it feels a bit out of the blue, if you're not paying close attention, which I haven't been. So I, in some sense, share that. But I think, it's not like, obviously our presence there has been kind of long standing. I don't know if maybe a little bit later in the episode we can get into, there was a Yahoo News report that came out just in the past week or so, I think, which is has some pretty interesting revelations in terms of the CIA's actions there, in terms of training like US-backed Ukrainian paramilitary, basically, for years, since 2015, since the coup, with pretty much the overt purpose of killing Russians, as they say. So yeah, I mean, I don't know how. Maybe I'll just leave it there, and Kenny, you can jump in.
What about you, Kenny? Anything you want to add? And we will go a little bit into the past as well, and then we'll talk about what do we think the heck's going on right now.
I mean, again, at least from the skimming through the headlines, right? Like, just like you two said, well, at least the sense I get is that the Russians are overreaching. They have 100,000 troops. That has been named, highlighted in a lot of the media that I've read. So this disproportionate amount of people right at the border, and there is no rationality offered, right, other than like Russian overreach. And Crimea is brought into the the equation. And before this even happened, actually, there was reported Russian presence in Kazakhstan too. Military forces helping the Kazakhstan, quote unquote dictator repress dissent in without really giving a lot of context as to what is the dissent about, if there is such a thing. And so that's the only thing I wanted to add. But like personally, like anytime I see all the media outlets narrating the same thing, I start to question, like, what is the story behind it? What's really behind it? And so, I guess I took a second to try to make sense of this, because like I'm not defending Russia, I'm not defending NATO, and because like NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and I think we'll get into that probably, because that includes other countries that are also taking action. It's not just the US. It's European countries moving, strategically, at least making moves in the area. And we'll probably discuss the reasons, but I know that that's happened also. At least it's been reported through media that, the Western allies, NATO, have strategically placed themselves, except Germany. Germany has shown hesitation in the process. And this is also because we've discussed it, right, in the past, in other episodes, that there was a de-escalation, quote unquote, of war in Afghanistan. And like maybe is there a relation to this? That that's something that came up to my mind. But I don't even know what to believe. That's the lesson I've had from COVID. And I think at this point, that just fully. A solid thought that I have when the media outlets are just bombarding me with the same story, I think of propaganda, and so I wonder what the goal is, what's really happening. How do we know there is 100,000 troops at the border, and what are they responding to? What are each, who's really the aggressor here? So those are kind of the questions that I get.
Can I say one more thing I meant to say?
Yeah.
Just in terms of like laying the groundwork for this discussion, my understanding is that Russia has said publicly, we have no intention to invade Ukraine. And I believe Ukraine has also confirmed that that's also their understanding. which obviously that raises flags about, how much of this is just US propaganda, US manipulated narratives.
Yeah. I mean, so first off, the establishment press has definitely been Russia is the aggressor, US is defending the territorial rights of the Ukraine. And, I don't, Anthony Blinken said this. He said, we've made very clear that one country trying to tell another one what its choices should be, including with whom it associates, that's not an acceptable proposition. Changing the borders of another country by force, that's not an acceptable proposition, because what it does is it undermines the entire international system. This is from the head, Secretary of State of the United States, which has been using sanctions all across the globe and using war to reshape borders for the last 20 years, for sure. I mean, it's been doing it for longer than that. The level of hypocrisy about that part is rich. But the establishment accepts that, and it does, like people like Tucker Carlson or Glenn Greenwald or people who have opposed the U.S. intervention or opposed the idea of U.S. war if Russia should step into the Ukraine, are being called Putin apologists, are being called, it's sort of the same thing as during Russiagate, when if you weren't opposed to Trump, then you must be for Putin. Is that what it was? Yeah. And so we really, and that's it. That's within the establishment. That's in the Democratic Party. It has really been fully taken over by neocon kind of war footing rationale. That if you're not willing to brook the idea of U.S. going to war to defend its interests, then you must be you're against this country and you're for Russia. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is, since the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. NATO is an arm. I believe NATO is an arm of U.S. empire by and large. It has been used that way, and U.S. entry into NATO was, yes, to keep Russia at bay, but it was also, they also said they would say keep Germany down, like to basically make sure that the U.S. was going to be the preeminent power in Western Europe and use that power and its control of Western Europe as a power source against what was the other problematic empire, which was at that time they weren't worried about China; it was all Soviet Union. So once the Soviet Union fell, there was a whole string of countries that started to be gobbled up by NATO. And then once U.S. went into Afghanistan, there was a whole new set of countries that were gobbled up, and bases were established. And Russia has been increasingly encircled by either NATO or U.S. bases and it's seen itself in the last 20 years and has felt threatened by that. And I do believe that they've essentially said that NATO must agree not to include Ukraine into its alliance. And the U.S. is saying, you can't tell NATO what to do. Anybody is free to join it, what have you. So that's the kind of discussion that's happening here. And I do believe troops are massing, because I'm not, again, at this point, I don't think war beat drums are being beaten, but something's going on here, at least from the vantage point of U.S. And I do think from the vantage point of Russia, I don't know what's happening actually from the vantage point of Russia, but I'll just say, I do believe the troops are massing, but I will say it feels like a move. It doesn't feel like war. It feels like a political venture to do something else. So I'm kind of tipping my hand as to what I kind of think's going on, but that's just my sense, and I'll leave it at that for now. Let's see if there's anything else.
I think when we are talking about like troops amassing at the border, it's also just important to be like really clear that we're talking about like Russia's border. Like they have every right to have their own troops within their own country at their own border, especially given, increasing presence and increasing threats. Every country has a right to amass all the troops that they want within their own borders.
Yeah.
I think that's an important point because when you look at the map, people can go on their own and look at the NATO map, right? It will it will NATO member countries map. It will show, right, like there's only a couple of countries that are at this point a buffer between Russia and NATO allies, right? And when you become part of NATO, you commit to like military action. That's one of their major roles, right? Like is to protect. They say you can go to their own website, and to protect their own interests. It's a political and military alliance, according to their own stuff. And that's how NATO came into Libya, right? Into free Libyans, and there's been other actions. But again, and I know that after the Soviet Union collapse, that there was an agreement, right, between that the European powers and the U.S. would not make a move east, like trying to enclose Russia. And so this is what's actually happened. And so geopolitically and like just logically, we've talked about like the irrational country narrative, right? Like North Korea. Why would North Korea act that way? Why would Cuba act that way? Why would Venezuela act that way? Why would Iran act that way? But like if you're being surrounded and attacked, like is it irrational to have a response, a preemptive response? And so that brings up the question, like who's the aggressor here, right? And so Russia feels encircled, and the borders are the NATO allied borders are moving closer to their literal borders. And so why would they not increase, military presence when they feel threatened, And but again, we are being told that they're just this aggressive, irrational, evil empire, right? And that is trying to redefine borders, which is ironic, right? And also exert a sphere of influence, which is ironic because we literally, this is the country that does that the most effectively, the US. And you brought up that point about NATO, Libsyn. And so in looking and researching about this, I ran into these numbers, right, of NATO's financial contributions commitments that, every country is supposed to commit like 2% of their GDP. But the average is about 1.5%, and the U.S. itself contributes 3.3%. U.S. being the biggest economy in the world, so the U.S. is disproportionately the biggest contributor to NATO financing. And yes, they talk about politics, but it's an extension of the U.S. military force. The U.S. is the big hegemon in that relationship with European countries. And so they have a big sway in what happens with NATO and, where NATO goes to war. And I just bringing it back to Afghanistan, like we forget, like it wasn't just the US, going into Afghanistan, it was a lot of NATO countries, we're talking about France, right? We're talking about Italy. We're talking about Great Britain. We're talking about, I don't even know if Canada is part of it, but I know Canada had presence there. So a lot of other countries were present in Afghanistan and they also had to pull back. Because if the big bully is not, on your side, if they stay there, they're gonna get eaten away too. And so a lot of these countries also had to pull back. And so I just find it interesting that now, like NATO is, from my vantage point, is on this another front, another aggressive, and another strategic move collectively.
Yeah, I mean, let me say some things that I think are still true, which is I still believe that the world globally can be described as being run under capitalism. And for that reason, I still believe imperialism is something that describes the way these countries compete, and that there's a competitive relationship between countries like United States and Russia and China, and even Germany and the United States. And at this point, Britain might be lining itself with the United States in competition with Russia and China. So that is still the world that I think is being described, or that that competition drives the world, and that competition, I do believe, leads to war and will lead to bigger wars. I think that's the case. But what I should say, but I would say that this particular moment, it's interesting to me because I'm not sure what I see is the drumbeat for war that is being talked about. Rather, I think I feel like there's a shell game being played here, like a political change the discussion. Because I did find out that back in April 2021, there had been an amassing of troops by the European Union had said about 150,000, and it was supposedly an overestimation. Russian troops were amassing on that very same border back in April 2021, and I guess they pulled back, and then now they're pulling back up again. At least that's what they were being told. And now, might Putin have a reason for doing that? Maybe, yeah, sure. But I do feel somehow that what's happening right now, and the U.S. is still preparing. It's preparing us and itself for the fact that its major enemy is not the war on terror. It's not ISIS. Its major enemy is China and Russia, and it's preparing the public for that. And this little conflict, or this, you could even say major conflict, establishes that narrative. But if I was to describe what I feel like is going on, it's like when people are tasting wine over and over again, and they have to drink water or something like that they have to cleanse their palate so they can taste another thing. I feel like politically we're having our palate cleansed of all this stuff that's happened around COVID and Omicron and all that kind of stuff, and the subject is just being changed rapidly, like right in front of us. And I don't know if it's because that narrative was because there were problems with it, and so they've just kind of changed the subject and made it, and essentially created a kind of crisis that doesn't even need. It's almost a manufactured crisis at this moment. And again, like Jessica's saying, I'm a person who's saying World War III is coming. I do believe it is. I just don't believe that this event feels more manufactured than something. And I do think this is the future. I do think these sorts of conflicts are the future. And this does give a vision of what might be future conflicts, but it doesn't feel real right now. It feels very manufactured. It feels like they're just trying to create a drama in front of us to change the subject so that they can reintroduce us to something else. What is the month right now? January, in March or April, to a new political season of ideas that we have to get ourselves acclimated to. Maybe a new variant or what have you. That's kind of what I think is going on, if you ask me.
Well, I have some thoughts on that. I partially agree, but can I just ask, this is a genuine question, because in my limited research, I have not come across any real answer to this question. Why is there any real reason why Russia would want to invade Ukraine? Like, what's the alleged reason that they would want to do that?
But the reason they would do it is it's sort of like, it's like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Can you really have a foreign power be so implanted there that it has the right to put like surface-to-air missiles that will shoot down hypersonic missiles and blah, blah, blah? And that was the reason that John F. Kennedy basically said, we're going to invade Cuba unless you pull that stuff out of there. And so essentially, this is right on the border. If they became and if they became part of NATO, then there becomes treaties or agreements that you can place defense weapons on there that, of course, would really not be, well, they would be defense, but they would be used as a way of putting Russia in even a deeper hole militarily if it was going to try to act against the United States in some way, shape, or form. So that would be the reason. It's a national security under the understanding that these are two competitive powers, and you have essentially, it's like a Warsaw country back in the day of USSR, a Warsaw country being right there at Mexico, and having, Warsaw Pact. You remember that alliance of the USSR, and having that country be armed by your enemy right next to you.
One of the ways, at least that I see, that you can handicap a country is to have them perpetually paranoid, because they would have to invest a lot of their resources into military action. That's what they did in Nicaragua, that's what they did in Cuba to an extent, North Korea. Because if you are so much up the border, and like they're constantly having to wonder if someone will come, or there will be an attack at some point. I think like, at least from my perspective, it's like also like a chess game. You're thinking moves ahead, because if they do take over Ukraine, then you have to deal with that immediate threat constantly. And so I think at least on the surface, that's like the immediate, rationale for me that I see. But I also think about like, why would the U.S. and European nations want to push, right now, and like, so then it does raise questions, as to the narrative. We've obviously been, even us on the show, look at our, like what we've been talking about. We've been so hyper focused on the vaccine stuff and forgetting about what's going on outside the world, because we used to do this stuff. We used to talk about what's going outside these boundaries, but and we are herded through the mainstream narrative. And so why the sudden change? Why this sudden hyper focus there? So you do have to have those questions, and Lipson brings an interesting perspective. I do wonder also if it's about China too, by putting Russia in checkmate, because when we talk about Russia and China, I don't think one or the other. I think it's both. If the U.S. is to take on China, it has to take on Russia too. And like having Russia on like sort of checkmate, or this like constant paranoid state again, it's important. And so because it doesn't necessarily require an aggressive move from the Americans or the European and the Western powers, as much as it required as an aggressive defense move, from the other side. And then in that it's very convenient to, look, you see, we told you they're the evil ones. We're just doing our job, even though it's rational for, Russia to defend this buffer, between them and the rest of NATO allies. Because yes, you don't want to have those weapons constantly being pointed at you, and like Lipson said, they are called defense, but they're not. They're a threat. They're a promise of a threat.
Yeah, and the same thing is if you look at South Korea, that's how South Korea is set up. It's basically lined with defense, anti-missile defense weaponry that is used to keep China hemmed in. And Trump's bid in North Korea at one point was to try to like make a friend of them to see if they could move another country into their hemisphere. It didn't work. But that is the game, is how do you get close to your enemy and put in defense weapons right there? And I do think that the people, the paramilitaries that were trained there and things like that, that is part of saying that if Russia does come in, it's going to pay a high cost in terms of losses of its own military through soldiers that have been trained by U.S. Special Forces to fight essentially to be a resistance force. And they will essentially do in Ukraine to Russia what they did in Afghanistan to the USSR, which is bleed them dry by supporting a resistance. So that is the reason why some people would say that Russia won't ever dare to do this, because there are parts of the regions that they're not as unpopular, but if they go too far, like what is it, Kiev? Is that what Kiev? Too far that they will face an actual resistance, and it will be one that will be it's a local resistance, but also one that will be funded by the U.S. And that would come at a big cost to Russia. I'll just say this: the interesting thing when you listen to people like Tucker Carlson, who is opposed to this kind of thing, the reason he opposes it is because he feels what this kind of move is doing is pushing Russia into the arms of China. And that he's saying, why don't we staying focused on our major threat, major enemy, China, and forget all this Russia stuff? Russia is not even a big player for the U.S. in terms of its future. So that's the mistake he's saying that is being made. He's saying that this bid is essentially putting the U.S. into fighting potentially two major powers simultaneously, and that's his reason. Now does not seem to be the majority sentiment, and certainly the Biden doctrine is really based on refashioning NATO together, rebuilding the coalition of NATO and the United States to represent the free world, take on China, take on the authoritarian powers of Russia and China. And one part of me also could say that maybe Putin did this because he sees that NATO is not united, and he sees that this could actually fracture or have the ability to fracture the alliance and weaken the U.S. internationally. So this is the kind of stuff that I just don't know, but it makes your head spin, for me at least, to start to think of all the different things that could be going on. All I can say is this came on suddenly. It's been done before, and it seems like something that came out of nowhere and has a purpose to it for becoming such a big deal, and everything else being wiped off the table.
I mean, what I do wonder is like how much, how much control do they really have of the situation? Like could it get out of hand, in some way, and like force each other's hands, want to do something. I don't know, just like wonder about that, because we talk about this third world war, and like we don't know like exactly the scenario that it might unfold, but it's, at least from my understanding, like it would be like a chain of events. It's not one incident, but it's a chain of events that result in things getting out of hand, because like at least the metaphor you've used in the past, Libsyn, is that that no one's really driving the bus, and so it makes me wonder, like these situations, and like if they can lead to events down the road, because like such fragmentations of alliances or new strategies being drawn, and so that's, I guess that's where I have my eye on. Like I don't like you. I don't know if it'll devolve into some sort of conflict immediately, but maybe down the line, because like there is a chess move and there are parts to it. It's not just one side, making a move.
And I mean, these are nuclear powers that we're talking about, and I mean, for that reason alone, like every single person on the planet, honestly, should be 100% for de-escalation. I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure how sort of secure I feel saying that, like, oh, it's not going to escalate into something even larger, because I think, I mean, interventionism, it always ends really well for defense contractors and arms manufacturers, right? And people who have stocks in those entities, right? I mean, I'm sure they're already making bank, right? Just from the, what are they calling it? Lethal aid that they're funneling in, that Biden's funneling in, like, I forgot how much, $200 million or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what is that? What the fuck is that even? Like lethal aid? It's like straight double speak. Yeah.
Yeah, and Nancy Pelosi passed or tried to put forward a bill around, no violation of countries' borders bill or something like that. It was the inviolability of countries' borders bill. Like, there's just a lot of theater. I would just say that's one thing. The second thing, honestly, again, these are some of the things that, the way I add things up. China has the Winter Olympics coming up soon.
Yeah.
And I don't think if Russia had an intention of doing something in relationship to the United States, I know they would have consulted China, and there's no way, I don't believe that they're going to do a move like this and have an actual intervention taking place and would have gotten the agreement from China. Oh yeah, let's go ahead and do that while we're having our Olympics. I mean, I don't know. These are the kinds of things I think about. And then if they, I don't think anything can happen until like about the middle of February, which I think was when those Olympics end. And I don't think things are just going to sit around like that and then suddenly they're going to pop off. So for me, this just feels like, look, like I said, I still believe war is inevitable between these big powers, but this particular conflict right now, I don't think it has more theater to it than some of the other things that I think are going on.
Yeah, because it makes me wonder, what, it's like if you look around, at least my sense is that, like, and what other interests does Russia have? Like, like you said, and by and large, they're not a big player, in the world. They do have a military, they do have a nuclear capacity, but I don't see why they would, go on the offensive, other than, that one argument that we were making, which is, at least in my view, a responsive, a reactive, strategy. It's not so much of like going on the offensive. We're getting imperial, like the old imperial way, like getting territory, getting new markets, getting new resources. And I don't consider Russia a big player by itself, in alliance with like China, and again, I agree, there's not like a solid alliance. These things can break off, because ultimately all these powers are in competition. But that's why I think of China and Russia together, not just geographically, but like financially, oil and these things that are exchanged. Because even when you look at Ukraine, that's another like angle that to this, that, I was looking at the biggest trading partners to Ukraine, and is Russia, China, are the big ones. And you have Germany, and then you have the US. The US is not even a big player there. So like, what does that mean? Does that mean the US want more markets? I don't know. But like, that's like another just angle that, that I looked at, is like, what are the economic incentives behind this? Not just like political theater and geopolitical strategy, but just like direct financial gains that the U.S. could give. Not just the U.S., because it's also the European powers, behind this. What could they gain from this? Because like, again, Russia is not really making threats to come into Western Europe. Like, they haven't. If anything, they seem to be on their heels, trying to like hold off some shit, because NATO has been very successful in encroaching closer and closer to Russia, and you could argue that there's really not even need to defend Ukraine. If NATO wanted to go to war, they have the proximity to attack Russia. So again, it's like, I'm just looking at other angles, like economic, angles that might incentivize maybe some even European countries whose aggression might also benefit, the US, because you do want to keep a potential ally of China on their heels. And that, that's kind of what that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I mean, at the risk of sounding like a Putin apologist, given the past few years, I mean, that man has the patience of a saint and the restraint of a saint, honestly. With regard to the whole China thing, I mean, yeah, like if it was China instead of Russia, right? Like Tucker Carlson and Fox News would be singing the opposite tune. So there's kind of a replication, I think, in terms of a lot of public opinion for people who are not, really looking into it and don't really look at the history of US interventionism. I mean, for the past 6 years, right, it's been for Democrats, Russia, boogeyman, evil, bad guy. And then for Republicans, increasingly, it's been China, bad guy. I think really, like, you're both exactly right. I think the US would be really, really fearful and threatened by the prospect of a China-Russia alliance. In part because I do think we're an empire in decline. I mean, I think one sort of contributing factor I see for this is just kind of like a flailing empire starting to crumble, and this is all we know how to do. It's like the American monkey knows 3 tricks, like lie, cheat, steal, and invade other countries, right? Like, no matter what the human cost or the ecological cost. And the economy is in the tank. People are poor. I'm talking about in the US. People are poor. People are angry, desperate. The approvals for virtually every politician are horrendous. Elections are, it's the US, elections are literally always on the horizon, right? So it's like, why not, go to war, or why not at least throw the and the threat of war around, because patriotism and democracy, right? Like any rhetoric that can help the ruling class to maintain their position of power, they're gonna do. Like, this is how many times have they freaking done this? Like, and I think, I mean, Afghanistan, to go back to that, from a few minutes ago, I think that's an embarrassment for NATO and for the US, the way that we left. And I think they know that. Russia knows that, China knows that. Yeah, I mean, we don't really have the grip over the world that we think we do, or that we like to sort of purport that we do. Yeah.
Yeah, I do agree that the U.S. is in decline as an empire. I think there were some who thought that thing in Afghanistan was actually kind of engineered by the United States, and that wasn't.
Well, I mean, I agree with that, but
Well,
it's still
that
embarrassing.
wasn't. Yeah, I honestly, that wasn't my take. I thought that made the U.S. look really bad, and I like, to the extent that I do think they were trying to get out because they had to remarshal themselves and essentially establish themselves for the real fight, which is the kind of thing we're seeing right now, which is an opponent like China, an opponent like Russia. I read what's called the interim. So I've cited this before. Under Trump, there was the 2018 National Defense Strategy, which basically said the war on terror is the past. Now it's war on the big powers, China and Russia. And there's an interim national defense strategy being put out by the Biden administration, which essentially repeats that same thing, but really establishes that the U.S. also must, in fighting Russia and China, must establish itself as reestablish itself as the leader of the free world and not be isolationist. And really, it puts NATO at the center of that. And then, of course, it talks about technology and biotech and 5G and artificial intelligence, blah blah blah, as the technologies that will decide who will win the wars of the future, kind of thing. So, in one case, I do actually, though, still believe that the U.S. is an empire in decline, and that it's possible that Russia also feels that and is attempting to put pressure, and it's trying to create cracks in the plan they have to rebuild their European NATO alliance. But the other thing that still comes up for me is, like, the entire news cycle was dominated by Omi-Con and vaccines and mandates and everything, and that has just been taken off the table. And I don't. There's a reason for that. Like, they still plan on using the mandates and the virus as a means of social control. So something, I don't know. I just get the sense that they were worried that this Omi-Con thing was unraveling, or that it just wasn't holding together. And in terms of like cases and who was getting sick and who was getting hospitalized and blah blah blah, and what it might have made their vaccines look like. I don't know. That's the kind of stuff I start to think about in terms of, as much for being able to locally change the subject. That's some of the things I think about when I see this stuff being drummed up. But again, I'm confused by these events right now, to be honest.
I mean, in one sense, like, if you believe this binary of, like, liberals, leftists are more like, humanitarian, socialistic. If you believe that, like, you could argue that on the right wing, there's more nationalistic, and like, this might be an attempt to bring those people into the fold, into the grace of the state, because like the people that believe America should be, a leader in the world, in Americans' military and the flag waving and all that. I think that there can be an argument to be made on that sense, of you're just bringing people back into the fold, And then, because you have on the left, leftists and liberals, like all about vaccines and submission of the population in that sense. But there's a lot of resistance on the right, in questioning the state, really. And the only big unifier for them is like rallying behind the flag, and like I think that's something interesting that I can see. But also, not only is it like convenient to, there's also an environmental aspect to this, because putting pressure on Russia, and remember that the north is opening up. There's the Arctic right at the north, and there's huge oil reserves. There's been strategic moves up there. NATO is involved in that. A lot of countries, in Russia has a big like decent operations up there too. And in trying to control those passageways too for training of the future, because it's trade, it's oil, it's big movers of the international economy. And so, putting pressure on Russia it has so many angles, that are beneficial to the U.S. and NATO allies. And so, so for me, at least, is the argument is like this move is way more beneficial to NATO and the U.S. than it is to Russians. And I do think Russians are on their heels in so many ways. And the political football here is Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't get a say. Ukrainians don't. And just as, I guess their only say is to see which side they're going to pick, and whose side might come after them. But I just look at all the angles and who is benefiting the most from this narrative. And even if I think it's not an actual, military action, like it just has so many benefits from pushing for the U.S. really.
Yeah, Ukraine hasn't had a say ever since 2014 or 15, whenever the coup was. I think too, just like since you bring up oil, that's one major reason why Germany is not on board, right? Is because they have pipeline. They have the Nord Stream pipeline with Russia. And then interestingly, I do believe Ukraine is pretty much oil dependent on Russia, which is an interesting, dynamic when you think about if this does escalate. Where is I going to go with this? So with regard to like the nationalism thing, you look back at, pretty much since, well, even before, like during Trump's administration, and then definitely since Biden, like we've seen in the States, all of these like neocon right wingers be totally rehabilitated, and suddenly you have like Democrats defending, like Blinken and Samantha Powers and fucking Bush. Insane stuff. And I think, yeah, you're spot on, Kenny. I think in terms of trying to like appeal to this patriotic, sentiment among Democrats, and it pairs really nicely, right, with the whole sort of COVID, like, we have to fight domestic extremists, get your booster, right? That's like the patriotic thing to do. US is the best country in the world. And we're going to go out and we're going to try to fight to distribute these vaccines all over Africa and all over the global South. It's like post 9/11 all over again, except it's the Democrats preaching this stuff.
Go ahead, Kenny. Go ahead, Kenny.
And that thought scares the hell out of me. The idea of uniting, like the pro-vaccine, pro like people ideology, and the pro-patriot, pro national security, state, and they bundling those up in some narrative that will make the state, not be questioned, be bulletproof. So I don't know. I think that the potential of that does scare me. You know, if these narratives are bundled up and you cannot question of any angle.
Personally, I don't think that kind of thing is in play, because at least in terms of the U.S. population, I don't think there's much appetite on the right for this sort of intervention and this sort of action on the part of the United States. I don't think people on the right are like, oh yeah, finally we get the U.S. flag flying in Ukraine. Things of that sort. I personally don't. I actually think there's more of a isolationist. We don't even need NATO. It's the kind of thing that Trump appealed to when he was being Trump, as opposed to the pro-vaccine person he is now. So I personally don't think that that's what's going on. Do you know that yesterday Biden withdrew his mandate or his call for the employers to, the employers over 100 to force the vaccine on them? Do you know he withdrew that yesterday?
Well, he's getting thrashed in the courts.
I know, but
why does he think? I mean, it's the Supreme Court is like straight Republicans. I don't know why.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that it's interesting to me that he was able to withdraw that under the cover of a different kind of crisis. Okay. And what it allows them to do is, because now you still have all these federal employees who are subject to these mandates, but he's withdrawing it. There's this giant noise about the Ukraine. He withdraws it under that noise. And, it's like, to me, it's just very interesting that these kinds of things are being done and under what moves are being made while a bunch of words are being thrown at us on the screen.
I do agree that, let's not lose our focus from this whole vaccine, fourth industrial revolution stuff, because I do think this is a sort of like a receding wave, right? You've also talked about these happening in waves, Lipson, right? Like the push for this new world order, the new systems of global governance, surveillance, tracking. And so I do, obviously there is a pause. I'm still on guard that that's still going to continue in some way. And so, yes, absolutely. This can be used in that way. And, it makes me think about like, what other ways could they use to push, right? If there is a sort of like some sort of exhaustion from the mandates, from that tactic, that technique, because we will, face more waves of, this paranoia, this psychosis, being pushed on us. And, you can't just rely on simply, let's call it fascistic moves, impositions, dictations on people, because you will find resistance, in growing resistance. And for example, I know personally that the resistance to boosters is massive. Like not massive, but like significant enough around me. Like I have a lot more people that were willing to stand up and say, no, I won't get the booster. And so, yes, the vaccine has been used as a vehicle to enact these systems of surveillance and tracking and passports, because it's not even about just the vaccine itself, like it's about the technologies, right? And so then, makes me wonder, are we then, oh, look, like you don't have to get vaccinated, but it's important to track each other, to track people. Okay, the vaccines may not work, like changing that narrative. And so, yes, it's convenient to start doing these steps under the guise of another crisis, like you said, to not show weakness or like retraction on your part. It's just that, let it die out for a second and bring it back in a new, in a new form of attack. And so, but I do think that is possible, and all this is possible. Like it's not just one or the other. Is that it's just convenient, to push Russia to distract from this shit, to move the news cycle to somewhere else, so domestic shit can happen. Because I don't even know like what's been happening internationally, but I bet you while we've been focused here, a lot of shit has happened internationally.
Yeah.
So that didn't stop, and nor will stop the stuff that's happening domestically. That won't stop because international shit is stopping. It's just the focus, like the trick of look over here is being switched on us. And it brings me back to that, what, John Kleisig brought up, right? Like the whole monkey experiment. If you keep, like monkeys, giving them contradictory, information or inconsistent, and like they don't know what to expect, then they just submit. It's hard to keep your eye on anything. Even like the whole Super Bowl thing, right? I don't know if you saw that they're going to give all 60,000 Super Bowl attendees N95s, right? And they're going to implement all these things, and they're going to display that to the world. I mean, the Super Bowl is the biggest display of American hegemony, on the world. And, they're going to push this mask that they previously told us that weren't good enough. They weren't doing the job for, COVID. But now they're being pushed. And, and so again, it just doesn't stop on either side. And so I guess I'm trying to figure out here, how do these things connect?
Yeah.
This is the most obvious one, right? Like the distraction, the change of focus. But I'm trying to figure out if there is more than that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know. This is another hypocrisy that I think about a lot, just because I'm kind of in the environmental sphere. But I mean, football stadium full of N95s. I mean, the waste that generates. And you've got Biden, right, going on and on about climate this, and we have to electrify the grid, and this is good, supposedly after COVID, this is going to be the next big thing, climate lockdowns and whatever. That's going to be the next big emergency. And the Pentagon, as it has been for I don't know how long, is still the biggest carbon emitter. Right. So it's like, this is just another example of just the whiplash of like, there was an article this week that I read about heart attacks because of climate change. This idea that, like, I don't know, I guess people are just so stressed over climate change that they're literally going to have a heart attack in their sleep. But then we need to send like millions of dollars of weapons halfway across the world. It makes no sense. So, yeah. And then with the sort of distraction thing, I mean, it's always a contributing factor, I think, with these wars, right? And then the election cycle, which is just so insanely rapid here, but then like in the UK, right? Because they're a big part of this. Like you were saying, Kenny, like it's not just the US. Johnson seems like, just barely hanging on by a thread right now. And yeah, I mean, I think maybe even more than an alliance between China and Russia. What is the U.S. empire more afraid of than anything? It's a true class struggle. And I think, I mean, I don't want to say it because I guess it's like, just feels like, I don't know. It's hard to tell, but I mean, looking at the truck, I know that's up in Canada, but, I do think slowly a class struggle is beginning to take shape because of all these mandates. And it's almost the first time, at least at this scale in decades, that's happened. And that's their worst freaking nightmare. And it's not, I mean, I don't think like Putin is for the Russian working class, but I think, we have to stay really focused. We shouldn't be blinded by just like COVID, but I think we have an opportunity, that we've begun to really pick up some steam. And I think we have to keep building working class solidarity, like however we can, like oppose politicians on both sides of the aisle, oppose nuclear power in all capacities, whether it's for war or for climate, green technology, oppose the Great Reset, and just keep building solidarity and build our own communities up, and just not fall for this propaganda.
Well, I guess, Kenny, were you going to say something?
I just find it interesting that what Jessica said about class struggle, and I don't know how much of it there is, but I mean there is a potential, right? Like that it could happen because people get fed up, but it's just interesting that international conflicts at this can be a very divisive thing for class struggles, right? In terms of who do you follow? Where do you fall in line here? I know historically, right, Lipson, like there's been that divide. At least some people were pro like the World War, some people were like participating and like supporting, the state. Others were not, and so that created divisions. And so like it's also like, again, this narrative is also convenient in that way. It can be potentially, and again, this is just, I'm just wondering so many things, and that's why
Yeah.
it's so hard to put a finger on this, but it does make sense, and that's why like I keep going back to like why the hell it is very convenient to Western powers who are driving this COVID narrative, who are driving the vaccination, in global dominance systems onto the world stage, who will control the global systems of, like vaccine passports, and because the WHO is with them, the CDCs of the world are with them, and why is it's convenient to all of them, to the same people that are pushing this vaccine madness. It's convenient for them to push this war, or this, like, at least the perception of a threat of a war.
Yeah, I mean, I will also say that, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure what entirely is happening. So that this episode for me has been an attempt to make my best guess. This question of struggle, is our ruling class, right? I'm talking about the U.S. ruling class, not the Canadian ruling class, but is our U.S. ruling class worried about struggle? Well, in my opinion, if they are, I don't know if they're paying attention, because the DC rally that everyone was saying, I heard numbers of 30,000 and somebody said up to 50,000. The pictures to me look like 5 to 10,000, and we were out in a rally at Oakland, which was fairly small. I think the overall statements that I've heard from people, and again, California is in a bubble of crazy COVIDians, and it's not across the country, but I don't get the sense of people on the verge of a pushback. At least I'm just saying from my vantage point. I do agree that the boosters are a tough sell, and are a tougher sell than the first set of shots. So, if one was to ask me what is happening right now, it feels more manufactured than actual real conflict between these powers. That's what I guess I would say. But we have had, that's my first bit on it, and we'll see, because the people who are saying U.S. has to do something are pretty much saying Russia is going into the Ukraine. And they're saying, you better do something, because they're going to be in the Ukraine in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And I'm kind of thinking that's not going to turn out. And part of it was like looking at some of those articles where, they were massing their troops a year ago, and I'm like, this has been kind of going on for a while. And then, like I said, like the change in subject. The one thing I didn't hear, I mean, this is kind of a different thing, but Jessica, when you brought up global warming is creating heart attacks, it makes me think about the fact that they were saying, well, remember that young people get heart attacks too. Apparently now, the thing that's going to create all these heart attacks is everything but a vaccine, which has symptoms of or side effects of myocarditis. So it's interesting to me that this whole theme of heart attacks coming from weird places is being pushed. I hadn't heard about the environmental issues and heart attacks as the stress of the environment creating more heart attacks. That just seems like another interesting deception around what's obviously, to me at least, the impact of vaccines, this mass vaccination campaign.
And I predict we're going to have waves of autoimmune disease. I mean, we already have crazy amounts, but kind of I mean, we talked a little bit about this with Amanda last week, but I think that's going to increase, and that is be very easy to blame that on climate issues, and it's also an opportunity for more medical intervention, more testing, more, big fertility, right? Like everyone's going to be, well, not everyone, hopefully, but, a lot of people are going to be sterile, whether it's from vaccines or whether, I mean, we are absolutely like surrounded by environmental toxins 100%. And the boosters are a tough sell, but do you know what's not a tough sell is, at least what I'm seeing, is testing. People are completely willing and are bending over backwards, at least where I am, which is not even a, liberal urban metropolis. Like people are fine testing weekly, testing every time they get a call that they've been exposed to somebody who's been exposed to somebody who's been exposed to somebody. And that, I mean, they've already gotten most of the people vaccinated who were going to be willing to submit. And I mean, it's great Biden's being struck down in the courts, but I'm not particularly reassured by that, because I think a lot of the mandates are really just, they're coming from the states. Like the state legislation is more important in terms of, what your employer can mandate. And so I don't see a whole lot of relinquishing there. Like the healthcare workers, that's been upheld even at the national level. So I don't know. I don't really feel like they're letting up, maybe as much as some people are saying. And the thing on the DC march on Washington, I don't know. I watched some of it. I didn't watch the whole thing, but as much as I know I've been preaching for like a year and a half, but like, yes, left and right unite. Like I was a little disappointed in just it was just there's so much raw, like patriotic, framing, tons of religious framing, which, I mean, some of it was fine. Like they had people from different religions, which was great. But, some of like the more like headline speakers, like I watched Del Bigtree, who was kind of like the big finale, just like screaming Bible verses to the skies. And I don't know, maybe that is what is appealing to a good portion of the country, but I just feel so much that what we really need to be expressing is just like international solidarity, especially with the global South. And I didn't hear that. And I was pretty disappointed, honestly, at a lot of what I heard from the speakers that I did listen to. There were some good ones.
Mhm.
It's funny that you kept saying testing and testing, because like that's another angle, and maybe this is switching things up, but that I think also about these technologies, like war get tested in proxy wars, or like biological weapons and things like that. It's not going to be the savior of the world, the U.S. that deploys this. But I do wonder what does lethal loads that they're talking about given to Ukraine, and because I wonder, we've been talking about this mRNA shit. We also have talked about these N95s, and releasing half of the supply for preparedness for an anthrax war, was released, and it's supposed to be sent to us, right? And so it just makes me wonder, like, I don't trust any of these maniacs, and so I wonder, like, what, maybe what if they are going to test some, maybe incite conflict between Ukraine and Russia, and see some of this shit played out, and again, in relation to, masks, in relation to mRNA technology, that we don't even know. I mean, all we know is that a lot of technology, the mRNA technology, came from DARPA, right? And we've talked about, like, a lot of these technologies have a military use, and they're in relation to creating super soldiers. and perfect war machines, and this is also in the context of, like you said, a declining power who understands that when the facade of propaganda falls, what is left is naked fucking violence, that underwrites all this shit. And so, it just makes me wonder again, like how these things connect, like what things we might see over there that we don't get to see, like the technologies that get displayed, because we have talked about the Third World War, and the world wars have been a full display of the latest technological, knowledge, right? Like, gases in the first one, and like bombs in airplanes, and all this machinery on the second one. And what we have now is like, genetic modification, automated shit, artificial intelligence. And so it just makes me wonder. That's why I get so uneasy, right? Like about this conflict. It may not pan out to anything, but considering the context that we're living, yes, it can be simply a distraction. But I also wonder: is it a test bed for all this shit that we're talking about? Because Afghanistan is kind of receded from the picture, and they've tested a shitload of technology in Afghani people, like to make them submit. And so they need a new theater. And so in like, they're not dumb. They don't want to go in a full scale war either, because they know, like, at that point is like, it will be highly destructive and disruptive. And yes, some people will make money, but like, I don't think, yes, they're fucking maniacs, but they also understand, how shit can get out of hand, I would hope. But that's what I wonder, like, is this the new theater where new technologies are going to be tested? And that's why, this whole drive to have N95s, and then maybe I'm diving into the conspirational shit, but that's our job to kind of wonder what the hell, right? Like, what the hell are they planning? And that's why this is so confusing.
Yeah, for me, I would say number one is, if Russia does invade, then I would definitely was not right in terms of thinking that this was just a distraction. That would be one indication that this was not. And if Russia doesn't invade, that doesn't make me right either. It's just, I definitely know that I am not anticipating some sort of incursion that then the U.S. has to do some sort of response, and then has to work something out with NATO, and Germany makes its own decision, because I don't think Germany is going to go along with the U.S. what it does, and blah, blah, blah. But anyway, that's just one thing I see. And I am tending to predict that there's just going to be a new story in March and April. Like, I don't know what that story is, but there's going to be a new story, and it's not going to be about Ukraine, and it's not going to be about Omicron. But I do feel like it's going to be about COVID, or the virus, or something, or a variant, or something. So that's something that I'm going to be paying attention to into the future. Because again, I do believe World War III is inevitable if capitalism stays, and I agree with Jessica that our job, or at least this is the way I would put what Jessica, what you were saying about what our job is here. Our job is to stop our government from going to war with anyone, and to take the weapons out of their hands forever, and empower people to arm themselves and run their own lives as an armed collective people, in international solidarity with other people doing the same thing to their local, because that's what the Russian people have to do with Putin, and that's what the Chinese workers have to do with, how do you pronounce the guy's name? Yao
Jinping.
Jinping, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, but whoever's running China, I don't know how to pronounce it. So,
Jinping, I think. My partner speaks fluent Mandarin, and apparently my tones are off. But he's going to be chilling with Putin at the Olympics.
Right.
Should be interesting. Just diplomatically. Yeah. You know what I saw today? I think it was on Fox. Just because, like, you're talking, Andy, about like there's going to be something new, some new narrative, or some new threat. And a lot of people are predicting that it's going to be like cyber pandemic stuff, right? This year, anyway. Mm-hmm. And I saw, okay, let's see if I can find it. Okay, the Department of
If I could say something about, just go on. Actually, people were predicting that there was going to be a big thing last year, cyber polygon and things like that. So there's been cyber shit that's gone down, but the scale at which I heard it was going to happen never materialized last year. But sorry, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Yeah, it's on the same note. So the Department of Homeland Security, this is just from, I think, the last couple of days, is warning of an imminent cyber threat against American companies and government agencies because Russia may soon launch attacks against critical U.S. infrastructure, a national security source told Fox News. So, I mean, it's like, make up your mind. Like, are the Russians about to like invade with physical troops? Are they launching a cyber attack? I mean, it just seems to me like more evidence that this is they're just throwing like, whatever stories they can and seeing what sticks. Yeah. I don't think we should leave this conversation before we touch on the Ukrainian neo-Nazis that the U.S. has been training. So I don't know. Is now a good time to touch on that?
Go ahead.
Okay. I'm gonna pull up. I don't know if you guys saw this. Yahoo News. Who would think it would be them? But they had a report. Oh, can I share my screen? Don't judge the number of tabs I have open. So I just think this is just really important. So this was just put out this week. The CIA is overseeing a secret intensive training program in the U.S. for elite Ukrainian special ops forces and other intelligence personnel. So this has been going on since the coup. Established by the Obama administration, and then it was expanded under Trump, and now even more so under Biden. So as usual, right, it's bipartisan, right? War and intelligence ops, like they're always bipartisan. U.S. officials deny that the CIA training program is or ever was offensively oriented. The purpose of the training and the training that was delivered was to assist in the collection of intelligence, right? This is despite I think it's like 14,000 Ukrainians have been killed since the coup. I mean, they've basically been in civil war. And I was reading a little bit more about, like who are these paramilitaries, and this is from Mint Press. So this is one of the sort of significant paramilitary groups, which is basically like embedded in their government at this point. And they're called the Azov Battalion. So their ability to provide training to U.S. white supremacy groups is a testament to the group's prominence in far-right and neo-Nazi circles. But the group's prominence is a direct result of U.S. government policy toward Ukraine. Originally a paramilitary group of right-wing Ukrainian nationalists linked to the country's Social National Party, Azov Battalion has since become incorporated into Ukraine's Interior Ministry as a component of the country's National Guard. In addition, the group's founder, Andrei Belitsky, is currently a member of Ukraine's parliament. Belitsky once said that, quote, "The historic mission of our nation in this critical moment is to lead the white races of the world in a final crusade for their survival," end quote. Despite the merging of Azov Battalion with the Ukrainian government, the U.S. has long continued to support Ukraine's military with hundreds of millions of dollars in security, programmatic, and technical assistance, all defensive, of course, largely in the name of combating Russian aggression. The irony, right, where you literally have the U.S. government calling, U.S. citizens who are opposed to mandates, terrorists, domestic terrorists, and extremists. Anybody who voted for Trump is a white supremacist. Meanwhile, we're literally funding and training like actual Nazis. It's just great. It's crazy. And I just want my student loans paid off. Like, really? Like, really? You have people like evicted from their fucking homes, drinking water in Flint, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's just so insulting.
I do agree that it's complete hypocrisy for them to be like talking about how the January 6th and having to defend themselves from the a new Nazi wave in the United States, which I think is fraudulent as in terms of the actual threat we're facing. I think the biggest threat to U.S. workers is the U.S. state, bar none. But I do think you point to complete hypocrisy that they might at the same time support those sorts of forces. I will say that, the U.S. history of supporting really dangerous, aggressive paramilitary forces across the globe, I don't think anybody has a better record of doing that.
Oh, yeah,
much.
like name a country. They did Cuba, Afghanistan. Literally, just like pick a country.
And the whole School of Americas, which was basically training people to do torture and to do local control of its own citizenry using the most horrible torture tactics. That's just the U.S. playbook.
They've experimented and perfected that in Central America. Removing powers, governments, installing new governments, installing dictators, supporting dictators, financing terrorism, torture techniques. All these what they were calling on these lethal loads. Like bombs, and they literally injected people with like syphilis in Guatemala. My country of birth. And so they are definitely, not beyond that. Like in the CIA itself, we know it's like the what is it? The criminal branch of the mob. The more criminal branch. They'll do what they have to do. Lie, cheat, or steal. There's people who have talked about it. What was that? Pompeo talked about it at a
yeah.
He celebrated that. They write a handbook, whatever, and that's part of it. Lying, cheating, and stealing. They're unapologetic about it. We know about this, and if you don't know this, then you don't know history.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but that is a fact. They do that in anywhere the U.S. has an interest. They support people. They often too contribute to both sides, so they can pick their hand when they need it. They're always in the move. They're always orchestrating things. But to kind of bring it back to Lipson's point, it's like these things will happen and will continue to happen as long as we don't realize that, an empire goes to war to the degree that they control the domestic population. And that's what's scary about this. I don't know if that this moment will materialize in a war, the Ukraine moment. What I do know is that the U.S. population is at high degree of submission. We are on our goddamn knees. They are literally robbing the house. They are changing the locks. They are installing cameras. They are in there, and they're making us believe that we need them.
Yeah.
And so again, our job is not to necessarily, have a judgment or like China, Russia. It's an international system. It's capitalism. They're all in competition. All the ruling class of the world are mobsters, and they have to be. The U.S. is the biggest mobster there is. And so long as we're not fighting our own ruling class, we're not only not helping ourselves, but we're not helping anybody else, anywhere in the world. So our job is to raise hell here so that our government doesn't go and do things somewhere else, because they are emboldened when they don't have to worry about us. And they have absolutely done an amazing fixing job on us, and like we just submitted, and we don't, and that's the magic of all this, COVID, psychosis, that we don't know what's up from down anymore, and so most people are just deflated and just letting shit happen, shit that's against their own self-interest. And again, like that, this is the call, at least from my point of view, is like that we need to realize that we, when they sell us evil China, evil Russia, they're just trying to distract us. Even if shit happens, they're trying to distract us from, like you said, fucking forcing their hand to get rid of loans, student loans, from fucking healthcare, right? Like it's the biggest scam there is. and fundamentally, me as a socialist, capitalism is the biggest robbery there is, and all the lies and the coercion we're subjected to. That's the shit that we need to fight here locally with people that we know. And if we really pretend to care about our comrades or our fellow workers in other parts of the world, because we won't stop them with slogans, we won't stop them with with just like posts. We will stop them by raising hell here, having them worry about their working class here.
I mean, why don't we build some fucking hospitals with all this money on arms, right? Like, we're in a pandemic. I keep hearing that the hospitals are still overloaded, right? I mean, medical debt's the number one type of debt in this country. It's criminal. And yeah, I agree though, Kenny, like, we're so domesticated, and I don't know how to get more people to, I don't know, wake up. I hate that phrase. Like, wake up and just and start to cut. I mean, it's hard to like cut ties from a system that you're so dependent on, like whether it's the technology or your health insurance being tied to your employment, right? So you have to do what they say. You have to do what they say, because how else are you gonna survive? How else are you gonna feed your kids? I mean, it is encouraging, like, seeing some of the solidarity that we've been able to build over the past 2 years, but we really got to pick it up. I think pick up the pace.
Well, I would agree with. I think, Jessica, I'm glad you brought up the degree to which people are saying, "Oh, let's get tested." Like, just as a reminder, like, those are indications of how deep our class is in the hold of another story that's keeping us trapped, in the way that Kenny's describing surveillance cameras being put in our homes and things like that. So that's the current. I do think that's the current reality. But I also would say that, like, this conversation itself, which we said beforehand, was going to be kind of an attempt to try to make sense out of a confusing sort of thing that's going on. There's definitely a story out there, but to make sense of what exactly is happening is confusing. So I think I feel myself subject to getting my head spun around by things, and being confused by what to keep my eye on. So I wouldn't be surprised if other people are that way. But I would just say that, for me, having this place to come back to try to, like, see what I think's going on and get my bearings again, these are the things that I think people will need to do in their own locales, and try to figure out what they can do to form their own local resistance. And there's Jasmine.
There's Jasmine.
So that's just, I guess that's what I would just say is, I think this is confusing for a lot of people, and I find it confusing for myself to make sense of things. But that should not stop a person, like where it didn't stop us, from reading a few articles and taking a moment to just say, "Okay, folks, what's going on?" I guess that's it then.
We'll be back next week.
We will be, yeah. So that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics, our guests, on the episode notes, wherever you found this episode, or on our blog, what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast channel there and connect with us. I remind folks, if you like anything you heard here, please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications to any of our 9 platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, Bitchute, Odysee, YouTube, Telegram, and Rumble. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. Well, Jessica, thanks again. Kenny, thanks again. And we'll be here next week. We'll see if Jake joins us, and eventually Eduardo's got to come back. All right.
Thanks, everybody.
See you next week.